It's 6:30 in the morning in LA and Vancouver, 9:30 a.m. in New York. Good morning to our colleagues in North America. It's 2:30 p.m. in London, 3:30 p.m. in Europe. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe. It's 7 p.m. in India, 9:30 p.m. in Singapore, Malaysia. Good evening to our colleagues in Asia, and well past bedtime for our colleagues in Australia. Namaste. A very warm welcome to everyone. I am Anupam Sibal. I'm the president of GAPIO. I work as a pediatric gastroenterologist and I'm the group medical director of Apollo Hospitals. For those who are joining for the first time, the Global Indian Physicians COVID-19 Collaborative was established on 11th of April to bring together 1.4 million physicians of Indian origin working across the globe on one platform. GAPIO now has members from 50 countries. Well, it's day 285 since the first case of COVID-19 was diagnosed. We know that COVID-19 has been reported from more than 200 countries and territories, 36.4 million cases and counting, with more than 1 million deaths, sadly. 6 million plus cases in India, 106,000 plus deaths in India. An explosion of knowledge like we've never seen before has taken place. On PubMed, there are 62,082 papers on COVID-19. That's 218 papers a day, 9 papers per hour. And by the time we finish this, we have to go back and read 13.5 papers that we would have missed. From India, there have been 3,599 publications till today. Today, we'll be discussing the hottest of all the hot topics of COVID-19, and that's the COVID-19 vaccines. I know there is a great deal of anticipation. We as clinicians are asked this question morning, evening, night by family members, relatives, friends, acquaintances, and everyone really that we know. Today, we'll be covering everything we want to know about COVID-19 vaccines. This is a high-powered program, 90 minutes of knowledge that otherwise would take several days to go through. We have leading experts from across the globe. And to set the ball rolling, let me invite my dear friend, Professor Santosh Sons, for his opening remarks. Santosh is the Chief Pediatric Intensivist and Neonatologist at the AG Institute of Medical Sciences and Research, Mangalore. He has served as the President of the Indian Academy of Pediatrics and Chairman of the Indian Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Immunization. He's the founder president of OM Guild Association of Associations. He's authored 5 books, has numerous publications, and has been honored with the Outstanding Asia Pacific Pediatrician Award, a National IMA Doctors Award, and the Dr. P.C. Roy Award. Over to you, Santosh. Santosh, please.
Thanks, Dr. Anupam, for the kind introduction. Hello, my friends across India and the world. COVID-19 pandemic is by far the greatest disruptor of life in entire human history. The novel coronavirus has immobilized each and every country across the planet. Even the last 2 world wars would not have caused such a global disruption. True, the loss of life or the limb might have been more heartbreaking in the last 2 wars. The general misery caused by the past pandemic might have been more. But what COVID-19 has done to derail our economy and cripple us morally, it has also exposed many deficiencies in emerging world order. Now all the eyes are on the medical science. The world looks up to us to provide a solution, but we too are completely blindsided even after 6 to 7 months. We have been groping in the dark, but in recent months, we have had much progress. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. Sharing knowledge is very important at this juncture. Today, people look upon the vaccine as a magic pill to make us forget this nightmare. People keep asking us questions regarding their fears and doubts about the COVID, and especially about the vaccine. This puts us in a position where we can educate people with the right information and clear their misconceptions. But I find it many of us still are as ignorant as the layperson. I'm glad Global Indian Physicians COVID-19 Collaborative has organized this webinar for free exchange of knowledge and latest update on COVID-19 vaccine. I wish to congratulate the organizers led by Dr. Anupam Sibal, internationally renowned pediatric gastroenterologist. Actually, he is a pride of our IAP for this unique initiative. The selection of the topic is very relevant and promising. The speakers are authoritative and who's who in the vaccine world. Hence, I see this webinar as a great opportunity to gain authentic knowledge on novel coronavirus vaccine and to know where the thing stands today. I wish us all enlightening and engaging participation in this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks ever so much, Santosh. We now begin with our first talk, and to invite the first speaker and introduce him, it's a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Nand Kumar Jairam. Dr. Nand Kumar Jairam is an eminent surgeon. He's the CEO and chairman of Columbia Asia Group of Hospitals. He has served as the chairman of the National Accreditation Board of Hospitals. He's currently the vice president of the Global Association of Physicians of Indian Origin. Over to you, Dr. Nand Kumar Jairam.
Thank you, Anupam. I would go straight on to the introduction of Professor Piyush Gupta, a renowned academician, teacher, researcher, and author with 30 years standing in child health. He has served as editor-in-chief of Indian Academy of Indian Pediatrics for over 6 years. He was honored by the National Academy of Medical Sciences, the Royal College of Pediatrics, the UK and American Academy of Pediatrics, and conferred the Teacher of Excellence by the Vice President. He has authored 30 books, 300 chapters, and 250 papers have been published by him. He is the President-elect of the Indian Academy of Pediatrics. Professor Piyush.
Thanks, Professor Nand Kumar, for this introduction. And thanks, Anupam, for giving this opportunity to be the opening batsman tonight. So I think I'll straight away start with my presentation. I bring greetings to all my esteemed panelists and dear friends. So I'm sharing the screen. Can just let me know when you can see.
We're good. I can see you, Piyush. Yeah, great. Just go on to slideshow, please.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Is it okay?
Perfect.
So we are talking about to start the ball rolling. First, we will start with what should be the ideal COVID vaccine. I think the ideal is far from achievable, but whatever is achievable have been clearly outlined. So we should know what is ideal, what is preferred, and what is critical. Let's have a look at this WHO target for this COVID-19 vaccines. Now, in the first column, you can see the parameters on which the ideal vaccine has to be evaluated, and then the correct qualities, the preferred and critical qualities in the next column. So the two most important things for any vaccine are the safety and efficacy. So we start with the efficacy, as we say that the preferred efficacy of this should be at least 70% on population basis, with consistent results, especially in the elderly. The endpoint may be assessed versus disease, severe disease, and or shedding or transmission of the COVID virus. Critical, if we say if preferred is not to be achieved, this is the ideal is 70%, but the critical, which is efficacy, is a 50% point estimate, and the endpoint again may be assessed versus disease, severe disease. And the most important, that successful vaccine should show disease risk reduction of at least 50%. In contraindication, the vaccine should not have any contraindication, except that, yes, someone like immunocompromised cannot be given vaccine may be acceptable. All ages should be able to take the vaccine. If not possible, then at least adults and elderly are a must. Lactating, pregnant women, and children, if they can be included in the vaccine target group, all the good. Adverse effects, there should be no severe adverse effect following immunization of the ideal vaccine, and only mild and transient adverse effects are acceptable. onset of protection. In an outbreak setting, there should be a rapid onset of protection. So in an onset, the current phase, the protection should be available within less than 2 weeks. And in the long term, then rapid onset of protection becomes less important. But as of now, we would stick to this preferred criteria of onset within less than 2 weeks. Number of doses preferred: single dose. Anything given once provides long-term immunity is always preferred. But if not possible, not more than 2 doses. That is the maximum that can be, we can go up to. Boosters, yes, may be permitted, but lesser the better. And the time of protection preferably should be 1 year. And if not, then at least minimum 6 months time of protection has to be there. The vaccine should be available in an oral or nasal, preferred non-parenteral route. But finally, if it has to be parenteral, then critical would be that any route may be acceptable if the vaccine is safe and effective. So the most important criteria here becomes safety and efficacy, and nothing light if it can be given by a non-parenteral route. Now, coming to the product stability and storage, the vaccine should be stored, should be able to store at higher storage temperature and should be thermostable. Again, in an outbreak setting, the shelf life of at least 6 to 12 months is desirable at -60°, and at least 2 weeks stability is desirable at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. Presentation: multi-dose vial, even single vial will do, but preferably a multi-dose vial, especially when it has to be given on a large scale. And the most important is that the vaccine should be, there should be the ability of scaling up of production at an accessible cost. That is the most important thing when we have to produce millions and millions of doses. All this is easier said and done, but there are challenges. Vaccine will be available, but how effective it will be is still not clear. Reasons: number one, we are still not sure of the critical levels of antibody necessary for protection. Human challenge study results are not yet available. Then effect at long term are not available since it's too early into the pandemic. Adverse effect, safety profile will not be known very early, but yes, we will have some preliminary, but the total safety profile will have to wait for a little longer. And then still, we are not sure about whether viral transmission will reduce as long as this is, the data is still not available. So to summarize, an ideal vaccine candidate has to be highly effective. We have defined the efficacy. It should be safe with no short and long-term adverse effects. All ages should be the target group, including elderly, pregnant women, lactating women, children. Should be single shot and preferably not parenteral. Should provide a long-lasting immunity. The duration, again, is as we said, the preferred and critical components, characteristics we have already discussed, and should be easy to store with no stringent temperature requirement. And finally, the vaccine when we go into the field mode, it has to be scalable, it has to be low cost, and then this is most important, that there have to be global distribution agreements so as to be available to every country and every person who requires a vaccine finally. These were my thoughts on an ideal vaccine candidate. Thank you. Thank you so much for patient hearing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Piyush. You could stop the slide share. I have to say, in 5 minutes, you gave us a fantastic overview of what the ideal wish list is, and clearly what we are expecting from a vaccine in record time is really very hard to achieve. Thank you so much, Piyush. Thank you so much, Dr. Nandkumar. And we move on to our next talk. And it's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Sudhir Parikh. Sudhir Bhai is a pulmonologist and a top expert in allergy in New York. He is also the chairman and publisher of Parikh Worldwide Media and ITV Gold Channel. Dr. Parikh's group has the largest outreach among Indian expats globally through his media empire. He has been honored with the Padam Shri, the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and the title of Knights of Malta. Dr. Parikh is the Secretary General of GAPIO. Over to you, Sudhir Bhai.
Thank you, Anupam, for a nice introduction. Really, good morning and good evening to everyone, all friends. It's my proud and pride and privilege to introduce Professor Daniel Lucy. But before I introduce Daniel Lucy, I'm very pleased to announce that my practice, my research institute is a part of the COVID-19 vaccine trial. And we are in the third phase of the trial, and we are collecting almost 30,000. I'm the part of the 30,000 volunteers who have participated in this vaccine so far. So let me introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Daniel Lucy, who is specialized in infectious disease, who works at the Georgetown University, USA. Professor Daniel worked overseas on HIV, SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika virus, flu, and plague. Based on his vast experience, he proposed the exhibition of this viral epidemics at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, DC, which opened in 2018. We all should congratulate Professor Daniel Lucy to achieve this milestone, that having a museum or exhibit at this prestigious museum in Washington, DC. Professor Daniel did his infectious disease training and MPH at Harvard University, served as a consultant in infectious disease at the NIH, and worked at FDA on vaccines. Since January 6, he has written over 45 COVID blogs in infectious disease journal and website. Let's welcome a distinguished guest, Professor Daniel Lucy. Professor.
We can't hear you, Prof. Daniel, if you just unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I just did.
Yes, you did. Loud and nice.
And
We can see you.
go to slide. Okay. There we go. And you can see the slides okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for this great honor to be invited to join such a distinguished international group of researchers, of professors, of physicians, other healthcare professionals. I think there are several hundred people on the webinar right now. So again, I'm very, very honored. In particular, I'd like to thank Professor Anupam Sabal. And I would like to speak now for only about 5 minutes. I have only 5 slides. There's obviously a lot of information. I'd be very happy to participate throughout the 90-minute webinar and during the question and answer session. So I've been asked to briefly summarize, and I'll do so in 1 slide each for each of the 3 COVID vaccine candidates that are now in phase 3 studies and enrolling persons in the United States. There is a 4th one, but it's still on clinical hold in the United States, although not in Europe or South Africa or Brazil. So the 3 that I want to emphasize. The first is Moderna, which is also collaborating with the U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, particularly the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, headed up by Dr. Tony Fauci. So the Moderna vaccine has already enrolled 30,000 volunteers, 15,000 of whom received a placebo, 15,000 received the vaccine. The vaccine requires 2 doses, 28 days apart, something that Dr. Gupta emphasized in terms of the importance of 1 dose or at most 2 doses. Well, the Moderna vaccine requires 2 doses, 1 month apart. It's an mRNA vaccine focusing on the S protein, does not require any adjuvant. Enrollment began the 27th of July of this year, and it's been completed in terms of everyone having received the 1st dose, and now people are receiving their 2nd dose, the volunteers in the study. It's my, and I emphasize only my anticipated date of late November, the second half of November, so a little over a month from now, at which time the Moderna company will most likely, if everything continues to go well without any safety or clinical hold issues arising, that the Moderna will request the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, for emergency use authorization, EUA. Emergency use authorization is, in my opinion, the way that COVID vaccines will first be allowed to be given to people in the United States outside of the clinical studies. Subsequently, it will probably be several months later when any one of these COVID vaccine candidates that receive emergency use authorization from the FDA will eventually receive the traditional and full licensure approval. The second of the three vaccines that are in phase 3 in the United States and enrolling volunteers now is one made by Pfizer and BioNTech, a company in Germany. Originally, I think there's a partner in China, Fosun Pharma, but I haven't heard much about them with regard to the trial going on in the United States. So usually it's referred to, this vaccine, as a Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. As with the Moderna vaccine, there's 30,000 volunteers, half of whom received the vaccine, half of whom received the placebo. But just recently, Pfizer requested an increase from 30,000 to 44,000 volunteers, and a request to decrease the minimum age from 18 years old to 16 years old. Again, something Dr. Gupta had mentioned in terms of the age range, whether it's the elderly like myself, 65 and older, or younger, younger than 18, eventually younger than that in terms of children. Like the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine requires 2 doses, although not 28 days apart, 21 days apart, so 3 weeks apart for the Pfizer vaccine. Again, it's an mRNA vaccine, so it doesn't require an adjuvant and focuses on spike protein. Our enrollment began the same day for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, and that is 27th of July. My anticipated date is mid-November, when the Pfizer BioNTech will request to the Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization. And the third and final phase 3 vaccine trial that's going on in the United States now and still enrolling has just begun recently. It's by Johnson & Johnson. They plan to enroll 60,000 volunteers worldwide. Many, I think at least a half of whom will be in the United States. This is notably a 1-dose vaccine. It's not an mRNA vaccine like the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, but it's a human adenovirus 26 vectored vaccine. Enrollment began very recently on the 23rd of September. My best guess for an anticipated date to request FDA emergency use authorization by the company is somewhere near the end of this year, perhaps in December of 2020. I guess I'd just like to emphasize one point very briefly, and that is that I think a very reasonable scientific question is, what are the data to support use of only 1 dose of this Johnson & Johnson J&J vaccine, as opposed to 2 doses of the Moderna or Pfizer BioNTech vaccine? What is the evidence for sustained protective immunity after 1 dose with this vaccine in comparison with the 2 doses of other vaccines, such as the Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech vaccine? I'll just leave that as a question. In reading the protocol for the phase 3 study that has been posted online for all 3 of these vaccines, and particularly trying to answer the question about why only 1 dose is needed for the J&J Johnson & Johnson vaccine. In their protocol around page 67, 68, they state very briefly why 1 dose is what they chose. But I'm not convinced of the scientific data that was presented in the protocol for one dose being sufficient in terms of lasting protective immunity. Again, a very important point that Dr. Gupta emphasized. And my final slide just emphasizes some very important news from this week, the 6th of October, where the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, made public, after approval from the White House, new guidance for emergency use authorization of COVID vaccines. I put the link there so that you can look at it yourself. It's 18 pages, the document that is. It will be discussed at a formal, open, public FDA vaccine advisory meeting on October the 22nd. I believe that's a Thursday, October 22nd. If you go to the FDA website, you can find the link to register and participate in this open public meeting that I think will be a very important historical event. The topic for the discussion on October 22nd, this FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, is exclusively COVID vaccine candidates. However, there will not be any specific COVID vaccine candidates discussed. There will be more general issues. And I think that this new document from the 6th of October this week on emergency use authorization will be the central discussion point. So I highly recommend that upcoming meeting to you on October 22nd. What I'd like to emphasize that is, in my opinion, the most important new requirement by the FDA for emergency use authorization for candidate COVID vaccines is that a longer period of time to acquire safety data. Specifically, it stated that safety data must be reported after a median, not a mean, a median of 2 months after the last dose of the vaccine in the series. So that would be the second dose for Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and after the one dose for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Also, I think importantly, the FDA guidance from the 6th of October stated that there needs to be at least 5 serious or severe or hospitalized cases of COVID-19 in the placebo arm, because there's some criticism about, well, what is the vaccine really designed to do? If it doesn't prevent severe disease, or if there aren't people being exposed to severe disease and developing severe disease in the placebo, then how will we know if the candidate vaccine protects against severe disease? I just want to add, without getting myself into any political trouble here in the United States, that in my opinion, there is a potential for unanticipated events to occur with the Food and Drug Administration with regard to COVID vaccines, as well as other issues that you probably are aware of, including monoclonal antibodies and certain drugs and convalescent plasma, et cetera. But it's possible that there would be unanticipated events that might occur with the FDA of a political nature before the US presidential election, November 3rd. I hope not, but I think that it's important to be aware of that possible unanticipated occurrence. And finally, I'd just like to emphasize that having worked at the FDA and vaccines for 3 years, and following daily, as I'm sure all of you are doing as well, the COVID vaccine unfolding history, in the United States, I think it's very important to recognize that it's the vaccine companies themselves, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and then quite a few others that will be doing studies, phase 3 studies, I think soon, that it's the vaccine companies, they must themselves first request emergency use authorization or licensure of their candidate vaccine from the Food and Drug Administration. So why am I emphasizing that as my final point? Because this is very, very crucial in terms of the process of getting FDA authorization for a COVID vaccine. So if the company doesn't request authorization or licensure for their candidate vaccine from the Food and Drug Administration, then the Food and Drug Administration will not act. They will not authorize, they will not license any candidate COVID vaccines or any other vaccines for that matter. So again, I just want to emphasize that there's been a lot of discussion about whether there be approval by the FDA of a vaccine or authorization before the November 3rd presidential election or not. Personally, I don't think that that will happen. But if no companies request the FDA to grant emergency authorization before November 3rd, then there definitely will not be any COVID vaccines authorized by the FDA before that date, November 3rd, or any other date. So it's really first up to the companies to make their formal request for authorization or licensure to the FDA, and then the FDA has to evaluate comprehensively the safety and efficacy and immunogenicity data and consult with their vaccine advisory committee of experts and perhaps with others and reach their decision. So thank you very much for the time and the opportunity to join such a renowned international group, and I'll be glad to answer questions later during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think the wealth of experience that you have, the decades of experience and your understanding of vaccinology and infectious diseases came out so well in that you presented in 4 slides what I think most people would have taken 40 slides to do. And thank you so much for the latest update from the FDA. For all our colleagues who joined from different parts of the world, I've just been told by Dr. Tandon that we now have participants from 23 countries. Daniel, I request you to, you put off the slide share. So thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Sudhir Bhai. We move on to our next talk, and it's a privilege for me to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Anupama, who's a pediatric anesthesiologist at the Children's Hospital of San Antonio, Texas. She's currently the president-elect of the American Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, will take over as president 21-22. May I invite Anupama to introduce Professor Adam Finn from the United Kingdom. Anupama.
Thank you, Anupam, for that kind introduction about myself. I live in Texas, so just a couple of days ago, I had a message from our Medical County Society to register and enroll for the vaccination. So we already started now. The process is in, the game started, so let's see. It's a great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Adam Finn. And Dr. Adam Finn is Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Bristol and an honorary consultant pediatrician at Bristol Royal Hospital for Children. He is an investigator in the phase 1 and phase 2-3 trials of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, as well as other trials now starting in the UK. He is a member of the UK NITAG called JCVI, Joint Committee for Vaccines and Immunization, and he chairs the WHO Eurotechnical Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. We welcome Dr. Adam Finn, and we look forward to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to speak. I'm afraid I'm not seeing on my screen an option. Oh, no, I am. Sorry, I'll just get this slide up. Here we go. Okay, could someone just confirm that you're seeing the slides okay?
I see very clearly, Prof. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, so my name's Adam Finn. I'm a pediatrician from Bristol in the UK. At Adam H. Finn is my Twitter handle, and at Bristol Uncover is the Twitter handle of our research group in Bristol, COVID-related research. I promise I don't tweet about Donald Trump or what I had for breakfast. I only tweet about vaccines. So if you're interested in vaccines, do consider following me. Yeah, a pleasure to speak to you all this afternoon, and at least afternoon in the UK. And I'm just going to give a very brief roundup of what's going on with the Oxford vaccine and also 1 or 2 other trials in the UK. Okay, how do I make this go forward? There we go. This is an animation from the Oxford Vaccine Group website of their vaccine. This is like the vector vaccine that you had just heard Daniel talking about from Janssen. The Oxford adenoviral vector is a chimpanzee adenovirus, which means that people receiving the vaccine should not have any antecedent immunity to the adenovirus, which would avoid that being neutralized. Into it has been engineered the DNA for the spike protein of COVID. There are no antigens from COVID, only the DNA for the spike protein. So people who've had COVID and have immunity, naturally acquired immunity, should not mount any immune response against this vaccine. So adenovirus is a DNA vaccine. It basically introduces the gene into the human cell, the muscle cell, when it's injected intramuscularly, which then expresses the spike protein, and that in turn induces an immune response. That's the principle behind the use of the vaccine. This is one panel from a paper published in Lancet a couple of months ago. It's the preliminary results of the phase 1 trial of this vaccine. And this panel shows some neutralizing antibody titers induced after a prime boost regimen of this vaccine, the priming dose given at day 0 and the boost at day 28. So you can see that there is some functional antibody being induced by this, which is comparable to the amounts of measurable neutralizing antibody in patients with PCR confirmed COVID. So potentially protective immune responses, though of course time will tell. The phase 3 study, which is details of which can be found at this URL at the top of the slide, is going on in 18 sites across the UK. It began at the end of May and is aiming to recruit a total of 12,330 adults, most of them 18 to 55 years old. The recruitment is not quite finished. There is a few hundred more individuals in the 70+ age bracket still to be recruited. But the majority of these people have actually received not only the priming, but also the boosting dose of the vaccine. The subjects are randomized 1-to-1 to receive 2 doses of the vaccine, or as a control, an active control, the quadrivalent meningococcal conjugate vaccine, in order that they do not become unblinded by the absence or presence of local and systemic reactions. The primary endpoint of the study is symptomatic PCR probe in COVID, and there are a whole long string of secondary endpoints, as you might expect, including severe disease requiring hospitalization, intensive care, ventilation, and death. There's obviously a number of safety endpoints, immunology, immune responses, both systemic, B cell, T cell, and mucosal, are being studied in detail. And I'm glad to say, because I'm particularly concerned about the ability of these vaccines to interrupt and prevent transmission in the population, this study is looking quite carefully for evidence of not only seroconversion to the N protein, that is serological evidence of asymptomatic infection, but also reduction in viral shedding by active surveillance of the study participants through regular swabbing. This is not something that's being done in, by any means, all of the studies, and something that I think certainly should be being considered. These are data from today's newspaper, actually, about what's going on in the UK. And you can see that in common with other Western European countries, we're seeing a very rapid rise in numbers of cases going on at the moment. This is, of course, extremely bad news for the UK in terms of its health and its economy, but it's extremely good news in terms of this study, because what happened was that the original lockdown drove down the incidence of cases to almost 0 in the July-August period, when we were expecting to see cases in an endpoint to the study. And the return of the virus now will enable us, I hope, to achieve an endpoint in the fairly near future. And as a matter of fact, in my centre in Bristol, we've had 2 subjects present in the last week who are PCR positive. So given that we need around 15 cases in total for an interim analysis and 30 for the predicted primary endpoint analysis, we may be in a position to see evidence of, or absence of evidence of, efficacy in the very near future. Otherwise, in the UK, there are a series of trials of other vaccines over a variety of platforms starting at the moment. One of a recombinant protein vaccine, commercially funded study is already recruiting. Several are in setup. There's an RNA vaccine that's been developed by Imperial College London that's similar in nature to the first two that Daniel told you about. This is a liposomal enveloped RNA vaccine, which is in phase 1. And we also, in addition to additional vector vaccines, additional adjuvanted recombinant protein vaccines, have at least one whole inactivated virus vaccine expected to be coming into phase 1 before the end of this year and into phase 2 in the early part of next year. We've got a large network of sites being set up across the UK. And this is quite challenging because we can't just do these studies in the established tertiary university centres. We need to do them right across the country in order to have the capacity to enrol sufficient numbers of subjects to all of these different studies. So that's quite a complicated process that's ongoing at the moment. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adam Finn. Anupam? Back to Anupam.
Looks like we've lost the boss.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you so much, Anupama. Really very well put, gave us a clear understanding of what's happening in the UK. So now that we understand a bit on what's happening in North America and what's happening in the United Kingdom, we're very keen to know what's happening in India. And to tell us what's happening with the Indian vaccines, we have Professor Vinod Paul, who really knows exactly what's happening in his position. And to introduce Professor Paul, it's an honor for me to introduce Professor Bamra. Professor J.S. Bamra is a senior psychiatrist in Manchester. He's chairman of the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, GAPIO. He's a board member of the Synergy Collaborative Centre. He's the deputy chairman of the Board of Science of the British Medical Association. He's served on the Council of the Royal College of Psychiatry and has been honored with many awards, including the CBE from the Queen for his services to mental health, diversity, and the NHS. Over to you, JS.
Thank you very much, Anupam, for that very kind introduction. And we've had some cracking talks, haven't we? Amazing stuff going on around the world around COVID. And for GAPIO to bring it together, I'm ever so grateful. So I'm very grateful, Anupam, as president of GAPIO, and also to Sudhir Parikh for the privilege of being here. Greetings from my president, Ramesh Mehta, and all the executive of GAPIO as well. So it's my pleasure, absolute pleasure, to introduce Professor Vinod Paul, because he's an icon when it comes to anything to do with medicine. We are dominated by pediatrics, I see, Anupam, for some reason. So Professor Paul, who does not need much introduction, I know, but I will try and introduce him, and I'm not going to do him justice because he's just a huge person. He's the head of, he was the head of Department of Pediatrics at AIIMS in Delhi before being appointed as member of Niti Aayog, Government of India. Professor Paul has been closely associated with India's health policy and programs in various roles over the last 3 decades. He is the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Medical Council of India, the governing body that governs doctors, as you will know, and he has played a pivotal role in the formation of Poshan Abhiyan and Ayushman Bharat Initiative. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Vinod Paul.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Delhi. Thank you, Anupam, for the opportunity, and very pleased to be in the company of such a distinguished gathering. I'm going to describe briefly where the vaccine journey of India stands as of today. Firstly, like to make the point that we as a country are very proud that we are in the forefront of vaccine for COVID-19. And this privilege comes from 2 strands of our strengths. Firstly, it is our industry. We supply 2/3 of vaccines for children across the world. And this has been there for a long period of time. And not only this industry dishes out vaccines, but also develops them. We have original development of vaccines from our industry. But also equally important is the fact that we have a very strong science and technology and R&D ecosystem. We have excellent laboratories of the Indian Council of Medical Research, of the Department of Biotechnology, and our Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, just to name three major agencies who can contribute toward developing vaccines. One of our laboratories of the DBT is a WHO designated laboratory for assays, for worldwide participation in assays for COVID-19 vaccine effort. From the academia and the laboratories, there are at least 3 to 4 vaccine candidates in various stages of our laboratories. I would like you to know that Indian scientists are endeavoring
disease chapter of IEP in 2018, and he also was a convener for immunization committee of IEP again in 2005 and 2006. And he is editor of books, and one of his book has been Immunization in Practice and IEP Pediatric Infectious Disease, and he has contributed to several modules on pediatric infectious diseases. So here is again one of our stalwarts from India, introducing Professor Shyam Kukreja.
Thank you, Dr. Virender Sharma. Thanks, Dr. Anupam, to join this, to make me join this prestigious group. And I'm really honored. And I'm now sharing my screen. So the data to collect on Chinese vaccine was not easy. So I've spent a lot of time collecting this data, and I'll be describing this in few slides. So there have been something like 35 candidates in clinical trial, these vaccines. Among them, 9 are in the phase 3. And out of these 9, I've underlined 4, they are from China. They are in the phase 3. Okay, their clinical trials started in April. They had 3 inactivated vaccines. The trials started in April. And one virus is adenovirus vector-based vaccine. The trial started in March. Phase 1, phase 2 trials results, they were unveiled in June, authorized for emergency use of 3 inactivated vaccines in July. And in June, it was adenovirus vector vaccine, which was authorized for emergency use. Their 4 vaccines are almost in the final stages of clinical trials, and they are supposed to be available in November, December, or early next year. Now, out of these 4 vaccines, 3 are inactivated vaccines being developed by Sinovac Biotech, which is a private company. 2 are being developed by China National Biotech Group, which is CNBG, also known as Sinopharm. It is state-owned, and they are making 2 inactivated vaccines. And the last one is adenovirus vector-based vaccine that is being manufactured by CanSino Biologic with Research Institute of Academy of Military Sciences. Okay, the first vaccine, the Sinovac vaccine. This is the vaccine which has been researched most. And in this vaccine, the same timeline which I have told you earlier, it was available in July 22nd for authorized for emergency use. And this vaccine has gone through phase 2 trials in 600 healthy adults in the age group of 18 to 59 years. And after this trials, they decided they'll be using low dose, that is 3 microgram vaccine in 2 doses at an interval of 4 weeks. And they have done another trial in the age group of 60 to 89, which interests us most. And in this age group, somehow they found the seroconversions were similar to what in the 18 to 59 year age group is there. So seroconversions were comparable, and seroconversions were to the tune of 92%. The GMTs of these 2 groups were comparable. Now, more than 24,000 people have been recruited in Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and they are planning to have Bangladesh and Chile also, according to the CEO of Sinovac vaccine. This vaccine got emergency use approval. As a result, many frontline medical workers have received this vaccine in China, and 90% of the Sinovac company staff, which is around 3,000 people, they've also received this vaccine. There are stringent regulation in US, European Union, Japan, Australia, which have historically blocked the sale of Chinese vaccine. But Sinovac plans to break that, and they want to apply for US FDA for this vaccine. The name is known as CoronaVac. And this vaccine, interestingly, trials are being started in the age group of 3 to 17 years. And this is before the phase 3 trial results are available. So it appears to be a little unethical to try this vaccine in children without the phase 3 trials and against the development vaccine playbook rules. But anyway, this is being done there. Now, coming to the next two vaccines, these are being manufactured by China National Biotech Group, CNBG, also known as Sinopharm. This is state-owned, and two vaccines are being made. This you must have seen in the social media, these two images, which a lot of discussion happening from where these vaccines are and all that. So most possibly these vaccines are available in UAE. They are being used in the healthcare workers. One is the Wuhan Institute Biological Product Vaccine, again with CNBG collaboration. And this is a virocell inactivated vaccine. Other is from Beijing Institute of Biological Products. This is also virocell vaccine inactivated. And these two products are available in UAE. So similar timeline of this vaccine also. And phase 1, phase 2 trials results are available in JAMA. The neutralizing antibodies were there in most of the individuals, and they have used this vaccine at an interval of 3 weeks, 2 doses. Now this Wuhan Institute vaccine is being launched in UAE, Peru, and Morocco. The phase 3 trials are going on in 15,000 individuals. Total is something like 48,000 of both the vaccines. And the Beijing vaccine is being tried in UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, and Argentina. On September 14, UAE gave emergency approval of these vaccines for the healthcare workers following successful interim results in phase 3. This is our guesswork, and I could not access this data of phase 3 interim results. Now coming to the fourth vaccine, that is CanSino biologic vaccine, that is adenovirus vector-based vaccine, which is being developed with the Research Institute of Academy of Military Sciences. Again, the timeline is 1 month earlier, but somehow it has lagged later in the phase 3, and all the 4 vaccines are likely to be available later this year. And Lancet study has been published for phase 2 trials, and in this, it has been used in the phase 2 in more than 18 years, 5,008 subjects. They tried 2 doses, one in 10 to raise power 11, other was 5 into 10 raised to power 10. And both the groups were used this different doses, and they were assessed for humoral response as well as T cell response. And both the groups showed good seroconversion and as well as positive specific T cell responses. And this vaccine, as early as in August, started their phase 3 in Saudi Arabia. The other countries which are using this as in the phase 3 are Russia, likely to be Pakistan, Brazil, Chile. This is according to Bloomberg report. China Central Military Commission approved this vaccine since June 25th for a period of 1 year for use in military people. And our concerns are 2. One is if you have an adenovirus 5 vaccine, the pre-existing antibodies may not make the vaccine very efficacious because of antibodies are already there against this common cold virus. And this vaccine had some issue with development timelines, and 1-dose strategy may not work. An inactivated vaccine, we have experience of dengue vaccine. The worries are it may create an antibody dependent enhancement. These are two issues. And with this, I say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Not easy to get this data, so really appreciate your finding the time. And it's a privilege now for us to go to Geneva, and we're going to be joined by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. Well, Dr. Swaminathan doesn't need any introduction. She's the chief scientist of the WHO. Prior to this appointment, she served as the WHO's Deputy Director General for Programs. She's a pediatrician with extensive experience as a global researcher in tuberculosis, HIV. She served as the Secretary to the Government of India for Health Research and Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research. She earlier served as the coordinator of the UNICEF, UNDP, World Bank, WHO Special Programs for Research and Training in Tropical Diseases. She's published more than 350 papers and has been elected as a fellow of the US National Academy of Medicine and fellow for 3 academic societies in India. Over to you, Professor Swaminathan. Well, she was on another program and she was meant to join, but as there is a delay, I'm going to take the liberty of asking Professor Ashok Datta to speak on the Russian vaccine, because we couldn't get our speaker from the Gamaleya Institute in Moscow. Professor Datta, if you just shed light on the Russian vaccine, and by that time we should have Professor Swaminathan come in. Dr. Datta, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So coming to the Russian vaccine, this was developed by a Russian institute, that is a Gamaleya National Research Center of Epidemiology and Microbiology. And they have developed actually 2 types of vaccine. Again, this is an adenovirus-based vaccine. They have developed adenovirus 26 as well as adenovirus 5. Both these vaccines they have developed, and they have 2 types of formulations which they have developed. One is a frozen form and another is the lyophilized, which is a freeze-dried form. So these are the vaccines which have been developed by them, and they have done a phase 1 and phase 2 trials in Russia itself. However, in both these trials, they have taken only very limited number, very small number of cases. In both phase 1 and phase 2, 38 cases, total 76 cases, 38 in each group they have taken. And that is why this is a small number of cases which they have taken. And following the phase 2, which has been published in Lancet few days back, they have found that the antibody titer is very, very good against the spikes protein, and as well as they have identified that they have that is CD4 as well as CD8 count with both frozen form as well as in the lyophilized form, they have increased. And based on that, they were trying to even start this vaccine for general use, but there have been hue and cry from the whole scientific you can say scientific people from all over the world, that unless and until you do a phase 3 with large trial, we cannot accept this. And therefore they have now started doing a phase 3 trial with 40,000 population subjects in this particular trial. And this particular vaccine is now known as Sputnik 5. They have given the name as Sputnik, the first shuttle, space shuttle name after the first space shuttle, Sputnik 5. And this particular vaccine has been in collaboration with the government of, Dr. Reddy's laboratory in India. They are with the Russian government, which is the Russian Direct Investment Fund. They are doing now, in collaboration with Dr. Reddy's laboratory, a protocol has been submitted to our CDSCO, and this protocol required some modification And initially they wanted to do only a phase 3 trial, but the CDSCO said that you should do both phase 2 as well as phase 3 trial. So now the phase 2 and phase 3 trial will be started very soon. And the Russian Development Investment Fund has committed that they will be providing 100 million doses of this vaccine in India. So this is the status of this vaccine. So far we know that this vaccine has worked in both these formulations, but they have used 2 doses. The first dose they have given, and following that the second dose they have given 21 days later. So these are the 2 doses, and after that they have done antibody titer on 7th day, 14th day, 28 days, as well as on 42 days. And they have shown that this after 28 days, the antibody titer as well as cell-mediated immunity response has been good. But unless and until a big trial report comes after phase 3, we are still will have to wait for this particular vaccine to be introduced, especially in India and any other countries of the world. This is what in short about the Gamaleya vaccine. Another Russian vaccine, they are also telling that they are in the phase 3, that is a Siberian Institute has developed another vaccine, which is a DNA-based vaccine. This is also phase 2 trial has been done, and they are going to bring out, do a phase 3 trial there. So these are the 2 vaccines which are developed by USSR Russia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Datta. And while we await Professor Soumya joining, we're going to move on to the Q&A. And to handle the Q&A, and the moment we see Dr. Soumya come in, we will go on to her remarks, and then we will keep carrying on with the Q&A. So to run the Q&A, we have Professor Ashok Datta, who's an emeritus consultant at Apollo Hospital, Delhi. He's former director, professor, and head of pediatrics at Lady Harding Kalavati Saran Children's Hospital and principal of Lady Harding Medical College. He's the India expert on polio eradication and member of the Indo-US Research Group, 175 publications, has edited several books, including on vaccination, a recipient of the Outstanding Asian Pediatrician Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award by National Neonatology Forum. Professor Datta is going to be joined by a young and dynamic colleague, Dr. Vinay Devraj, who's an internist and an infectious disease specialist. He is the head of infectious disease at Apollo Hospital, Bangalore, and runs the adult vaccinology program. Several publications to his credit. I'm going to hand over to Professor Datta and Vinay to start the Q&A. And like I said, the moment we have Dr. Soumya, we will go back to Dr. Soumya and then come back to the Q&A. Over to you, please. Thank you.
I'm here now, Anupam.
Oh, great, great. Oh, great. So we will have the privilege of hearing. We do understand that you had another television program going. So thanks ever so much for finding time for us. You know how busy you are. So over to you, Professor Soumya.
What would you like me to touch on, since I've missed most of the discussion?
Okay, so let us tell you what all we've discussed. So we talked about the ideal candidate, which the guidelines the WHO gave. We talked about the 3 US vaccines. We talked about where we are with the phase 3 trials and what are the FDA expectations in terms of the new guidelines that they issued on the 6th. We then went to England and talked about the UK and the Oxford and the other UK vaccines. Then we discussed the Indian vaccines, and Professor Paul gave us an overview of all the Indian candidate vaccines and where we are with those. We then had an overview of the Chinese vaccines, the 4 Chinese vaccines. And then Professor Datta talked to us about the Russian vaccine. So there we are. That is all that we've discussed. So over to you.
Yeah, I've unmuted now. Thanks very much. Greetings to everyone, and apologies for coming in late. So I can maybe give the viewpoint from the WHO. And we've been doing a number of different things. Starting with the beginning, in January, we actually convened a global research forum where we looked not only at vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics, but also at a number of other areas where, obviously being a new virus, there was very little known about it. And so we came out with a research roadmap with a number of knowledge gaps and research priorities. And then 9 different working groups were constituted. They started working on things like epidemiology, on the animal source of the virus and the whole, animal to human jump, and then on clinical management. There's a group that's been very active on that, on infection prevention and control. And then we set up expert groups that started looking at some of the enabling sciences, things like standardizing animal models. Again, being a new disease, a new virus, there was no known animal model. So for therapeutics, for vaccines, you need that. Also, we started looking at standardizing laboratory assays, neutralizing antibody assays, and other kinds of immunological tests. So that was quite a lot of early work that started. And meanwhile, we also put together a group that started looking at designing a vaccine trial. And we came up with the Solidarity Core Protocol that went up on our website in, I believe, in May. At the same time, we had also developed the target product profiles that you mentioned, so that developers of vaccines, and there are 2 kinds of target product profiles. So there's a vaccine that's used essentially as a preventive vaccine, and another one that could be potentially used in an outbreak setting, so as a responsive vaccine. And there are 2 sets of target product profiles. And then we started having these talks with developers and also maintaining a landscape on our website of all the vaccines in development. And that's updated every week. So we know now that we have about 40 vaccines in clinical trials around the world, and about 10 of those are now in late phase 2B or in phase 3 trials. And the first 2, of course, were the Moderna vaccine and the AstraZeneca, both of which started vaccine trials in July. And then shortly thereafter, this was followed by some of the other candidates, including the Pfizer candidate. There have been several Chinese candidates that have gone into phase 3. And then more recently, the Russian, there are 2 candidate vaccines from Russia. And then we have, of course, 3 trials going on in India that you've heard about. What we are looking at is, so we did on the R&D side, we work with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI. They are the ones who are actually funding the R&D. They've got 9 candidate vaccines in their portfolio and another 9 which are in later stages of development. We work on policy. So we, of course, the WHO has something called the SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group of Experts on immunization. And this SAGE has been functioning for many years now. They are the ones who do global guidelines for immunization. So they set up a working group on COVID vaccines, which is just reported back to the SAGE. They've come up with 2 sets of documents. The first one is the values and preferences. That actually explains the principles like equity, justice, reciprocity, and both global and national equity as principles for how you would distribute vaccines. Because for us, the development of vaccines is as important as the fair and equitable allocation and distribution of these vaccines. We don't want to see a situation where there are a lot of vaccines, but all going to the rich countries, while all the other countries in the world are waiting in line. So from the very beginning, the access issues and the equitable access was an essential element of our plans. The second document that SAGE has just come out with, I think it will become public in the next couple of days, is the prioritization framework. So it's basically a guide to countries on how they would go about prioritizing within their own countries populations which should be vaccinated, because we know that in the beginning, there are going to be limited number of vaccines. Whether it's the US or the UK, you're not going to have vaccines on day 1 for the entire population. You will get a few tens of millions of doses initially, and this will then get into hundreds of millions of doses, and eventually we may have billions of doses if many candidate vaccines actually prove to be successful. So the idea is that you have a phased approach, the first phase being those who will be considered at highest risk in any particular country or society. And everyone seems to agree that healthcare workers would fall into that category, followed by other kinds of frontline workers, followed by those who are older, because we've seen across the world that older people do suffer disproportionately and much have higher mortality rates. Now, the definition of older is going to vary. In Japan, older is going to be over 80. In India, it could be over 50 or 55, just because of the demographics of the population. So this is for every country to decide, because if you are given, say, 15 million doses at the beginning, who are those 50? And then, you know, most of these vaccines are 2-dose vaccines. So you have to keep that in mind. You can't just give 1 dose of the vaccine to 15 million people. That's not going to serve the purpose. So who are those 7.5 million people who will get the vaccine initially? And then subsequently, how do you? So many countries have put in place task forces and committees and have started looking at this. And have also started looking at supply chains, distribution networks, etc. The third set of activities that WHO focuses on is on the regulatory side. As you know, that we have a system of pre-qualification of drugs and vaccines, and many low-income countries or majority of countries around the world rely on WHO pre-qualified drugs and vaccines. Countries which have their own, very stringent regulatory authorities do not, but those are only 5 or 6 countries. The majority will. So we have already started now. We've opened last week. We put out a call for a rolling submission on emergency use authorization of vaccines. So if I can just spend a minute on that, generally a vaccine or a drug goes to a regulatory authority with a full dossier with data on efficacy and safety and applies for a license. Now, in an emergency situation, as we are in now, in a pandemic or in some other kind of an emergency, I think this was invoked for MDR-TB also, where bedaquiline was authorized to be used, even though it had not gone through phase 3 trials, because MDR-TB is a disease that kills people. So you could have a situation where regulators would look at data on an interim results. So you would look at efficacy data, but you would also look at safety. You cannot bypass safety. Efficacy data, you can get signals on interim analysis. But safety, you have to have the follow-up. So the FDA has put out clear-cut guidelines, and so have we. The WHO actually put out the guidelines before the FDA to say this is the basic minimum data that we will be looking for. And we've told developers they can start discussions, they can start sharing whatever data they have, and we will be looking at that. And at a point where we are comfortable, there may be an emergency use authorization that's provided. Now, national regulators have jurisdiction and authority within their own countries. So a national regulator can always approve anything based on the data that they are seeing for use for their own country, their own citizens. But a WHO authorization or a pre-qualification would enable a global procurement agency like Gavi or UNICEF to actually procure and distribute vaccines to multiple countries. And we're working with, so as I said, we work with CEPI and Gavi, and together we have the COVAX facility. Today we have 171 countries in COVAX, including China that just announced that they were joining. This represents over 70% or much higher actually now that China is joining. Probably close to 90% of the world's population is now part of the COVAX facility. And the advantages there are that you get a choice of vaccines. We don't know which of the vaccines is going to be successful. We hope that several will be. So there's a flexibility and a risk pooling in investing in many vaccines. And the second thing is that because the procurement will be done on large volumes, you're also likely to get good prices on these vaccines. And so I think it's good both for the self-financing countries. We have about, I forget the exact number now, but close to 80 or 85 self-financing countries, which means that they'll actually pay for the vaccines that they're going to buy and have already started paying in advance to the facility so that the facility can invest in advance market commitments to companies. And then we will have the Gavi eligible countries. There are 92 countries which will get the vaccine at a very low cost or could be possibly also free. So the Gavi board has now endorsed a decision where the countries which are eligible for the Gavi support will need to pay somewhere between $1.50 to $2.50 per dose to share the cost of the vaccine. But there may be countries, low income, very low income countries that cannot pay that, and they should not be penalized for that. And so we need to raise resources, about $8 billion, to ensure that at least 20% of the world's population is vaccinated. So the goal of the COVAX facility is to get 2 billion doses of vaccines by the end of 2021. And then we will go in 2022, probably, hopefully, into a situation where there is not so much of supply constraints. But 2021 is going to be a lot of supply constraints. There is going to be politics involved. There's going to be a lot of issues. But we are hopeful now because so many countries have come together in COVAX and they have committed to equitable access. So let us hope that we are able to get vaccines out to people in all countries at high risk populations, whether they are just healthcare workers or a small group of people, but not face a situation as we did in the past and the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. That's what we want to avoid. A few countries garnered all the doses of vaccines and all the doses of oseltamivir. And the rest of the world would have had a terrible time if it hadn't been for the fact that the pandemic didn't turn out to be very serious. And then rich countries started giving away, the vaccines they had because they had extra stockpiles. But we don't want to repeat that now. It won't be right. And that is why now I think all of these efforts in advance to make sure that it happens properly. And finally, we have the solidarity trial. So WHO actually convened a consortium of countries and partners to launch a solidarity vaccine trial, which would actually test multiple candidates head to head against a common placebo group. And that would enable efficient and fast testing of as many candidates as possible, because ultimately we want the best vaccines to be made available. The first ones may or may not be the best. So I think it's important that we test a good number of vaccines, including those that are coming from India, so that we ultimately have, good quality, safe, efficacious, and affordable vaccines. Thanks. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Swaminathan. So over to Dr. Datta and Vinay. Of course, there were many questions that were that had been asked at the start of this session, but many of them have been answered. So I'd urge you to just focus on stuff that we haven't discussed. We will do this for 12 minutes because I know everyone has to leave. It's been a long session. So over to you, please. Next 12 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Now let's rush straight to the questions. I think I'll take the initial 3 to 4 questions, summarizing the doubts that have been raised by the audience as well. Dr. Piyush Gupta summarized the ideal vaccine candidates that the WHO has listed. My first question is to Dr. Daniel Lucy. Since multiple vaccines have been put out, the FDA usually does not give emergency use authorization unless there's a desperate situation like this one. Are we looking at the ability of vaccine to prevent infection as well? If you look at the WHO criteria, it doesn't look at the ability to prevent the spread of infection. It only looks at seroconversion. So how is the vaccine and the vaccine candidates at US tackling this issue? How does FDA give approval if at all this is not the criteria? So what does Dr. Daniel have to say on this?
Thank you very much for the questions. Yes, be very brief. First of all, I think it's important to emphasize that the US FDA has never granted emergency use authorization for a single new unlicensed vaccine. It's never done that. For drugs, for diagnostics, yes, but not for vaccines. So it's really uncharted water in a sense. And with the update from the FDA this week, as I mentioned, October the 6th, on new guidance, they look at both laboratory diagnostics in terms of documenting the infection, but also, as I mentioned just briefly, about severity of clinical infection. So there needs to be a certain number, perhaps 5 or more serious infections in the placebo group. But to the best of my knowledge, there's not clear requirements in terms of preventing transmission of the virus itself, particularly asymptomatic infections, but that's still under discussion. It's a very, very important issue that has been emphasized, for example, by some leading researchers from University of Hong Kong, School of Public Health. just recently. That is, will these candidate vaccines prevent transmission as well as disease? So again, I just want to emphasize, I encourage everyone to, if you can make time on October the 22nd, coming up very soon, about 12 days from now, on Thursday, October 22nd, there will be a public US FDA all day long open discussion about COVID vaccines and emergency use authorization and criteria. Thank you.
Right. So not only time, I think with time we'll get to know whether the vaccines are able to prevent transmission of infection as well. So the second question is to Professor Adam Finn. I think following up your work, you seem to suggest if at all the vaccine comes up for emergency use authorization, we need to prioritize who gets the vaccine first. And you seem to suggest probably the 60+ ones should be prioritized. But if you look at the demographic data, it is varying in different countries. In India, the bulk of deaths that happened up to about July to September, 60% in the 50 to 69 year age group and 43% in a 30 to 59 year age group. So it's kind of a confusing scenario. So how do you think the vaccine should be prioritized as to what age group gets first? Professor Finn, how do you solve this conundrum?
Vinay, I think Adams had to leave. So
okay, sir. Okay, I think can we go back to Dr. Daniel again? If you can take this question, how do you prioritize age-wise? The demographics of the people who are vulnerable in the West is a bit different compared to what is in India. So how do you think the prioritization should be? What do you think should be the age group which gets prioritized for vaccination? Professor Daniel, if you could take this question as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, just briefly, in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about this. At the National Academies of Sciences. Also, usually the Centers for Disease Control has an advisory group called the ACIP that gives official advice about prioritization of new vaccines. And certainly the age criteria is one that's really still under discussion, whether it's age 60 or age 65 and above. As another speaker emphasized, in Japan, it's over the age of 80. Perhaps in India, it's in the 50s. So it's really still under discussion. The US CDC's advisory group has not formally made their recommendations. Again, I think everything is going to be very much accelerated in terms of prioritization on October the 22nd on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee discussion date, and very soon thereafter on or around the US presidential election date of November 3rd. So the short answer is it's not settled yet, but it's actively being discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I can just extend the same question to Professor Paul and ask him, sir, I mean, once the vaccine gets approved in India as well, so let's hope by the year end or early next year. So how are we planning to do it? Because when Professor Swaminathan discussed about equitable distribution, one, that countries like us get the vaccine. Second, how are we going to divide it? Will it be a government mandated vaccine protocol, or will private players have a say? How will this pan out once vaccine comes to India? If Professor Paul can take this question.
Well, essentially, we will invoke the same principles that Dr. Swaminathan highlighted, that first and foremost, it should be protecting the frontline healthcare workers and other people who have an excess risk of contracting infection for a societal cause. The second part of that priority is to aim at reduction in mortality. These are now generally accepted universal principles. That the second priority bandwidth is to reduce mortality. And mortality, we know, occurs in a higher proportion in old age. So age criteria would be an important consideration. We also know that mortality occurs in those individuals who have serious comorbidities, chronic diseases of a severe nature, and that has to be accounted for. So first, bandwidth of scale up of the vaccine would address those who are protecting the health system, protecting the society, and then immediately alongside are the priorities that are linked to reduction in mortality. And then, of course, there are other considerations in terms of creating a herd immunity someday. if we believe the vaccines are capable of doing it. We will, of course, invoke the principles of equity. We will invoke the principles of access to people where affordability is not going to be an issue. Based on these principles, the government will take the decision. The pathways and frameworks for those decisions are being discussed, and multiple scenarios are being envisaged, wherein maybe there's a limited supply, maybe there's a little more supply. So all that is work in motion, and at the right time, this will be disseminated. Thank you.
If I might ask Professor Paul, because there are a lot of doctors who work in the private sector on this CME. So do you visualize that it will be through the government machinery that the vaccine will be administered, or you would, like you did for treatment and for diagnostic? This was a beautiful example of the public and the private sector coming together. How do you visualize that?
Well, let me first say that when I said healthcare workers, it will include the private sector healthcare workers. That part is already a high principle when the insurance was offered for healthcare workers as a part of the Prime Minister's initiative. So, but other issues, whether we should invoke a private market or it should be only through government channels, we have to wait for a while, because there are so many uncertainties at this point in time. But let the time come. What we will do would be in the best interest of the people of India and in the larger interest. By the way, India is also committed to ensure that part of our stockpile is available to other nations, and we will work with the COVAX, and we will work with our other countries for that work as well. And we are also interested that trials of Indian vaccines should also be conducted in other countries, particularly in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question will be to Dr. Datta himself, then he can take over the questions. Sir, do you think that this is an audience question? Do you think that we need to confirm COVID presence through RT-PCR before we vaccinate any of these individuals? And do you think in such case where we do not test, vaccination can potentiate the infection and end up causing disease? What are your thoughts on that? And then you take over the question and answer session.
Okay. I don't think it will be possible to do RT-PCR in each and every case for giving vaccination for a mass vaccination program. And I do not think that it will be required right now. And especially if you are giving an inactivated vaccine, or most of these vaccines are not live attenuated so far, whatever we are doing, whatever is being tried. I don't think there would be any problem. So you can safely give without doing an RT-PCR test. There has been another question from the audience. What is the temperature of the Russian vaccine? Now, the Russian vaccine, Gamaleya Institute has got two types of vaccine, as I have already told you. One is the frozen and another is freeze-dried, that is lyophilized. The frozen vaccine needs to be kept at -18 degrees centigrade, whereas the lyophilized, you can keep it very easily between 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. There is another question which has been asked by Dr. Anupama. What were the serious side effects from the phase 3 trial, all the current vaccines? Actually, in this, there was a serious side effects which was observed with the Oxford vaccine, for which the trial was stopped for certain period of time, including in India also. And that was the GB syndrome, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was seen in one of the case. Ultimately, it was found to be not associated directly with the vaccine, so it was not vaccine related. On this issue, I will like to ask any other panelist if they have observed, and especially Daniel, if you have observed any other serious side effects in this particular vaccine. Daniel, please.
Again, thank you very much for the chance to briefly respond. To the best of my knowledge, there haven't been any serious adverse events with any of the 3 studies in the United States that are still enrolling that I mentioned, the Moderna, the Pfizer, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. But in the United States, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine phase 3 trial, which did begin, but after approximately 1 week or 8 days, it was put on clinical hold, and it still is on clinical hold. So there's no more enrollment. The few people that got the first dose have not received the second dose. And the USA in this sense is different than Europe, and I believe Brazil and India and elsewhere, where the AstraZeneca vaccine has come off of clinical hold. I think in the United States, there's concern about apparently a total of 2 people that have experienced neurological adverse events. So I've heard rumors that the clinical hold will come off soon in the United States, but until it does, I think we just have to wait and see. But otherwise, with the other 3 vaccines that I mentioned in my presentation briefly, there haven't been any known or reported serious adverse events. So
Thank you, Daniel. I have a question. I got a question for Soumya. Dr. Soumya, there is a question for you. What is the WHO stand now for safety data, whether it is for 6 months or for 2 months? Can you hear, Soumya?
Yes. Yeah.
And the
So
chat
yes, this is a question that this is something that we've been discussing internally, and I know that the FDA and European Medicines Agency and other regulators are also thinking about this. We believe that it has to be for at least 2 months after the last person has received the last dose of the vaccine in the clinical trial, in the phase 3 trial. So that means that the follow-up needs to go beyond when an interim analysis may be done and initial efficacy data may be presented. Because, you know, if you accumulate a lot of endpoints, you could actually start getting some efficacy signals before you have even completed the enrollment or the follow-up. So I think this ensures 2 months from the last person having got the second dose of the vaccine will ensure this. And that itself is a very short period. I mean, ideally we would look for 6 months, but again, because this is an emergency, and as was mentioned earlier, WHO has also never done an emergency use authorization for any vaccine. The novel polio virus, NOPV vaccine may be the first one actually, and then the COVID vaccines may follow. But it all depends on what the committees feel and how confident they are when they look at the data. And we do work closely with the regulatory agencies, with the ICMRA, which is the International Coalition of Medical Regulatory Agencies. So I think that their thinking is quite harmonized across.
If I might just ask, and maybe Dr. Datta, with your permission, and maybe Professor Swaminathan or Professor Paul could answer that. There's virtually no data. I mean, there isn't any work happening in pediatrics at this point in terms of trials. Now, a lot of questions that parents come up with, and in fact, there's been a lot of speculation that perhaps schools, going back to schools and all, should be linked to vaccination, which of course is not going to happen because there is going to be no vaccine. So the kids will lose a year if we actually look at physically going back. How is it that the approval is going to come for the pediatric vaccines? Because if we are going to wait for data in phase 3 for pediatrics, then we're really looking at end of next year after all the adult work finishes. So if both of you could comment, please.
Well, you know, we know that children are exposed to infection and they get infection. The second zero survey of ICMR and also Delhi zero surveys show that children are equally prone. And of course, these are 10 years and above. We don't have data below 10 years. So they get the infection. But when you see clinically evident infection and serious infection, there is very little. And mortality is negligible. So the public health prudence would lead us to consider the fact that children need to be immunized, if at all, at a much later stage. They cannot fit into a high priority, and they may not really be needing any immunization. So this can wait. But definitely, we need to immunize the teachers. We need to, but you know, because they will come in contact with the children who would spread the infection, and of course they themselves can spread infection. So here the public health paradigm has to be applied. Mind should be kept open. And in any case, when you have a new drug or a vaccine, you do keep in mind the fact that once you demonstrate safety in adults and efficacy in adults, only then you come down toward the lower ages. So those principles will be kept. Soumya can elaborate on this.
Soumya, what do you like?
I think Dr. Paul he said everything. I don't have to add anything. I think that was a perfect explanation.
Okay. Now, I have a very basic question to Dr. Soumya. Originally, can you hear me, Soumya?
Yes, yes.
The original strain which was found in Wuhan was of a D strain. Now, many of this world now, especially 85% of the strain now it is changed from D strain to now G strain. All the vaccines which are being manufactured is with the previous strain of just D strain. Would there be any effect on this development of the vaccine with this new strain, with the old strain?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a fear that people have, that if the virus mutates, then what's going to happen to the vaccines? As you know, as you mentioned, that the first set of vaccines are all basically working on the spike protein.
Yes.
You know, the epitope is all of them the spike protein. So if there is a significant mutation in the spike protein, especially in the receptor binding domain, this could affect the vaccine, but it would also affect the virus. You know, it may or may not then be able to bind so efficiently. So the mutations are being tracked. So far, there are over 130,000 whole genome sequences in the GISAID database. Plenty of mutations, and as you know, several different clades or strains have been now identified. And there are a couple of mutations that are being tracked by scientists because either they are associated with increased transmission or they could have an implication for drug or vaccine. But so far, nothing that's very concerning. But the good thing is that there's another lot of vaccines that are using some of the other proteins of the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2. So there is in development as a backup vaccines against some of the other proteins. And the other thing, of course, we don't know is the duration of immunity that needs to be studied, and that we will know only as time goes on, and whether, like influenza vaccine, whether we will actually need to redesign. But you know, the pace of mutations of this virus is much, much less than influenza. So it does seem to be a much more stable virus in that sense. And most of the mutations have been minor mutations, which have not had a big impact on the structural part of the spike protein.
Professor, last two questions, please. Last two questions.
Actually, there is another question for Dr. Soumya only. Was the interim analysis done for Chinese vaccine, which was given emergency use authorization by, and if so, what was the result? Is there any data available which regularized, reviewed this interim data before authorization?
So the authorization was done by the Chinese regulatory authority. So, you know, we have not seen all of that data, but they have published. Both CanSino and Sinovac have, and I think the Wuhan one also, they have been publishing actually in the scientific journals. So there is data available on phase 1 and phase 2, but we have not seen the submissions that they've made to the Chinese regulatory authorities on the basis of which the emergency use was granted. And that's, you know, it's only happening within China. Similarly, the Russian vaccine has been granted emergency use within Russia. So now what we are asking all of these developers is to start sending us that data as well, as they complete phase 2 and then accumulate phase 3 data, so that we will be also able to assess and then make a recommendation on either emergency use or ultimately pre-qualification is what we would aim for. But that's going to take a little more time.
Okay. Now, last question, I would just like to ask one more question. And what about the view of repurposed vaccine? So far, other vaccine has not come so far. So what is there any use of giving repurposed vaccine?
So I think we're talking here about live vaccines, live
MMR
attenuated
vaccine,
vaccines,
OPV vaccine, BCG vaccine.
MMR.
MMR,
Exactly.
BCG, OPV. These are the vaccines which have been shown to be benefiting.
Well, they are supposed to stimulate the innate immune responses,
That's right.
innate immunity. And so it was presumed or hypothesized that these would provide some protection. But as of now, there's no evidence. So there are trials going on with BCG as well as with MMR, I think. And we have to wait and see. We have to wait and see, because the childhood BCG vaccination, which we give in India at birth, we cannot expect that to be protecting people after 15, 20, 40 years, you know. But whether a dose of BCG will protect someone or will increase the protection for a certain length of time just by stimulating innate immunity, because, and this came from studies which showed that after BCG vaccination, the incidence of sepsis due to other causes in children was reduced. And that therefore it was hypothesized. But as of now, there's no evidence at all. And we can't go by this kind of historical things like because BCG is used in India, mortality is low in India, and therefore the two are related. I think that there's no logic there. So we have to wait for the randomized trials.
Thank you, Soumya.
The trial, Dr. Datta, the trial on BCG in India is complete in terms of enrollment. The results will be available after a follow-up, and the deadline is January. So in January, we would know the BCG trial results, the study that has been done in India, and it's complete now.
Okay, thank you, Vinod, for this information. There is another question. Another question was
Last one, please.
It was from the chat box, I can see. Measuring IgM and IgG levels testing is necessary before consideration of vaccination. The answer is no. So with that, I thank all the panelists for their excellent contribution. And I thank Anupam for giving me a chance to be a member in this panel for asking questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks ever so much. This has been fascinating. We had colleagues from 25 countries. Big thank you to Dr. Soumya, to Dr. Paul, to Daniel, to Adam, to Sham, to Dr. Datta, to Vinay, Santosh, Piyush, Dr. Jairam, Sudhir Bhai, Anupama, Dr. Bamra, Virinder, Bhupinder, Bhavna, who put this all together. And I think it's very symbolic that as we wait for the vaccine and we hope for better treatment, we have to re-emphasize social distancing and hand washing. And Daniel, I couldn't help but notice that you put on the mask to remind us that, and Dr. Paul's done that as well. So as we leave, we have to remember that masks are here to stay. Thank you so much for joining, and look forward to hosting the next session on the 31st, where we're going to be talking about patient safety with experts from across the globe. Thank you very much. Good night. Good afternoon. Have a lovely weekend.